Hello, and welcome to this video which will look at the Renaissance philosopher, writer and diplomat Niccolo Machiavelli and study how his pioneering work on leadership and power has remained extremely relevant to the leaders of the 20th and 21st centuries. This video will study two areas of Machiavelli's work. First, the study of how modern leaders have exhibited what can be seen as traditional Machiavellian traits in their actions, before studying how modern leaders have also embodied lesser established parts of Machiavelli's scholarship, which advocate a different type of leader to that popular Machiavellian legend. It will be argued that Machiavellian associations are far less relevant to Machiavelli's scholarship than popularly believed, and that the term Machiavellian is essentially an inconsistent label for a particular type of deceitful politician, which holds little relevance to its eponymous inspiration, whose extensive scholarship on republicanism did not welcome the Machiavellian leader. This will outline how the necessary disassociation of Niccolo Machiavelli and the phrase Machiavellian welcomes a better understanding of Machiavelli's work and beliefs, not governed by Machiavellian principles, despite the associations of his name, but by ideas of liberty and the rights of the people. It will therefore help to better interpret Machiavelli's relevance to modern leaders and modern politics than the narrow relevance that his popular Machiavellian legend offers. In the Renaissance era, an era of rebirth, Machiavelli wrote detailed advice on the subject of leadership by assessing ancient histories, particularly that of ancient Rome, and applying the values and practices which he discovered to the late 15th to early 16th century leaders who occupied the world which he lived in. He used this methodology to notice where these rulers succeeded through imitating these ancient methods, and where they faltered through omitting them. Emulating what Machiavelli did in a sense, the same methodology which Machiavelli ascribed to Renaissance leaders can also be applied to modern leaders, by using Machiavelli's writing as a basis for the triumphs and failures of contemporary leaders. Machiavelli's work is considered incredibly influential. However, it is The Prince, an instruction guide for new princes and royals, which advocated pragmatic immorality, which has dominated Machiavelli's reputation. These most extreme areas of Machiavelli scholarship have been attributed to the phrase Machiavellian, common in workplace personality studies, and used as shorthand for individuals who exhibit opportunism and self-interest above morality and fairness. The psychological field of Machiavellianism has become one of the dark triad traits, along with narcissism and psychopathy, causing Machiavelli's name to become synonymous with personal deviousness, political ruthlessness, and manipulativeness. However useful the phrase Machiavellian may be in these psychological studies, its outward association with the man, Niccolo Machiavelli, himself, promotes a misunderstanding of Machiavelli, in which Machiavelli is himself a Machiavellian. Although he famously focused on the advantages of deception and deceit to a leader, Machiavelli in fact believed firmly in the ideas of fortune, God's favour, a mixed government, and the rights of the people. His supposedly Machiavellian writings in The Prince were analytical rather than ideological. Considering this, the traditional use of the phrase Machiavellian is a misleading representation of Machiavelli's ideology. The idea of a Machiavellian ruler is a narrow depiction of Machiavelli's scholarship, a selection of specific areas of his work, to create a term for a certain breed of politician or person who inhabits traits that Machiavelli explored but did not see as idealistic by any means, and these specific areas of Machiavelli's work have been developed to justify the practice of such traits by modern leaders. However, to first look at those specific sections of Machiavelli's work, we can pinpoint where modern leaders have acted in what has been seen as typically Machiavellian ways. Machiavelli stated that princes simply must use force to gain and maintain power. In The Prince, Machiavelli argued that a newly conquered state, which shares the culture and customs of its new prince, and has previously been a state of hereditary succession, will generally support their ruler, as long as the prince wipes out the old ruling family. This bears a striking resemblance to the situation in Russia in 1918, when the previously hereditary monarchic state had been overthrown internally by Russian revolutionaries, and the decision was made to execute the Romanov family, as their existence posed the threat of counter-revolution. Lenin was the head of the Russian state at this time, and was openly influenced by Machiavelli, as Robert Service outlined in his 2000 biography of the Russian leader. Lenin was particularly influenced by Machiavelli's writing on brutality in governance. So, this is the case where we can pinpoint the exact lines of Machiavelli's work, which would have provided insight for Lenin when approached with this particular issue. It is these kind of associations with leaders, who generally hold a very negative reputation for brutality and dishonesty, that typify the Machiavellian leader, and have been extended unfairly onto Machiavelli himself. Additionally, Machiavelli also gave advice for those rulers who were occupying foreign territory, both through direct occupation and as colonies. In this case, Machiavelli argued that only through defeating threatening foreign neighbours and becoming an ally and defender of weaker foreign neighbours can stability be established by the leader. Machiavelli mentions how the Romans would weaken fellow foreign powers around their newly established territory so that they were the strongest and most appealing foreigners in the area. Machiavelli's writings on this subject have been identified as a partial justification for the post-9/11 US foreign policy, mainly in the Middle East. From the initial war with Afghanistan, the US has partook in various military and diplomatic actions in Iraq, Pakistan, Yemen, Syria, Libya, and various other nations. Therefore, largely in the Middle East, the US has removed those powers in the area who they considered to be dangerous enemies, and has also sought allies in the form of Israel and Saudi Arabia. In this sense, they have followed Machiavellian advice in an attempt to establish dominance within the Middle East. This comes as little surprise when multiple influential figures in the policy-making of the US and of its allies are said to have studied Machiavelli's works. American historian and foreign policy analyst Michael Ledeen spread neo-Machiavellian teachings which advocated aggressive foreign policy through his works. These circulated around neo-conservative circles within the Republican Party in the Bush administration. These are believed to have been particularly relevant in influencing the decision to invade Iraq in 2003, an invasion which many saw as preemptive and overly aggressive. Furthermore, in terms of the US allies, Tony Blair's Chief of Staff Jonathan Powell published The New Machiavelli: How to Wield Power in the Modern World, which was a study of Blair's time as Prime Minister through the teachings of Machiavelli. In The Prince, Machiavelli also encouraged a swift and total removal of opposition upon taking power, so that these deeds may be forgotten quickly and not be repeated throughout a reign. This is considered typically Machiavellian, as an act of cruelty which is exercised in a systematically quick fashion, so that its psychological impact is lessened. In July 1979, just a week after becoming Iraqi president, Saddam Hussein called an assembly of party leaders which he ordered to be recorded. It was at this assembly, so early in his leadership, that Hussein is said to have acted in a Machiavellian manner, purging the Ba'ath party of 68 apparently random men who were alleged co-conspirators in a Syrian-backed plot against Iraq. 22 men were executed, with the other alleged conspirators given weapons and made to execute those 22. This classically Machiavellian tactic established Hussein's brutality and instantly indoctrinated those executors as actors in his regime, masking his actions as popular justice. Hussein was considered Machiavellian by many in his lifetime, a typical Machiavellian leader who conspicuously enjoys power and authority and does not tolerate any challenge to his leadership, according to Abdul Khalek Abdullah's 1994 piece on the Gulf War. It is also considered Machiavellian for a leader to create an ideal public image of themselves, which differs from their true characteristics. Machiavelli claimed that men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, arguing that a leader who portrays themselves as deeply religious will earn affection, irrespective of whether their actions are genuinely in line with this image which they have created. If the means are considered honest, Machiavelli claims that the leader will be praised. In modern times, where much of society is less religious than it was in the 16th century, Machiavelli's advice largely applies to those who earn power due to popular support of the religious population. Right-wing leaders such as Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro owed their elections to the support of the religious. Trump gained 81% of the white evangelical Christian vote, whilst Bolsonaro gained almost 70% of the evangelical Brazilian vote. Both have been considered Machiavellian for their use of religious justification for controversial policies. In the midst of the American Black Lives Matter protests, a group of protesters were dispersed using tear gas and riot tactics to allow Trump to pose Bible in hand in front of a church, which had been damaged through protest. This use of violence in order to create a politically valuable photo opportunity to improve Trump's public image as a Christian is typically Machiavellian. Meanwhile, Bolsonaro opted to call for a national day of fasting and prayer to free Brazil from the evil of the coronavirus pandemic. As Bolsonaro had been criticised for what many deemed to be poor handling of the pandemic, this religious call for unity was an attempt to divert attention away from his political tactics and towards his public image of having a devout religious faith. Both these two leaders have been portrayed popularly as Machiavellian. Professor of political science Anthony Brunello found that Machiavellian measures and standards remain relevant today and that Machiavelli would understand President Trump. Meanwhile, Bolsonaro's political ideology is heavily influenced by the ideas of Olavo de Carvalho, a political philosopher who is known for his eccentric interpretations of works by Machiavelli. Machiavelli argued that an individual wishing to reform may opt to guise their reform, instead portraying their actions as leading to the preservation of existing or old methods. Machiavelli felt that despite these changes in fact holding nothing of the old practices, mankind is more interested in appearances than realities, and will fall for this pretense, even as the leader tampers with the very basis of their traditional laws and practices. The 1933 German Enabling Act, or Law to Remedy the Distress of People in the Reich, gave Hitler and the Nazi Party absolute power to dismiss the Weimar Constitution and enact laws single-handedly. Signed by President Hindenburg, the act changed the ordinances of Germany completely. However, in a typically Machiavellian act, Hitler and the Nazis portrayed this legislation in an entirely different manner, to remedy distress and to bring the distressed state closer towards a previous state of greater prosperity. It also promised to sustain the rights of the president and to be expired should the current government be replaced. This promise to restore previous superior values and reaffirm the powers of the president, neither of which were truthful promises, were therefore rouses which allowed radical reform to pass without substantial public dissent. According to former Nazi Hermann Rauschning, Hitler had read and reread The Prince, deeming the book indispensable to every political man. For a long time it did not leave Hitler's side. The reading of these unequalled pages, he said, was like a cleansing of the mind. It had disencumbered him from plenty of false ideas and prejudices. It is only after reading The Prince that Hitler understood what politics truly is, said Rauschning. Hitler's Machiavellian inspiration also extends to yet another integral moment in his rise to absolute power. Machiavelli stated that upon taking a state, a soldiery that is disloyal to its leader should be purged and replaced with a loyal one. This is Machiavelli's assertion that a prince requires militaristic strength to become truly powerful and autonomous. In June 1934, Hitler chose to purge the SA, a paramilitary organisation which was deemed to be semi-autonomous, and possibly, in the process, of planning a military coup which would see the removal of Hitler and of his allies. The SS, a paramilitary organisation that Hitler believed to be far more loyal to him, was ordered to eliminate the members of the SA. At least 85 people died in the purge, and many more were arrested. This removal of a seemingly disloyal soldiery by Hitler was therefore typically Machiavellian by its classic definition. It was a brutal consolidation of power by any means. Machiavelli also theorised that the surveillance of citizens was integral to countering internal conspiracy within a state, which he considered far more threatening than external threats to a prince. Although in modern times the capabilities of mass surveillance dwarfs what was feasible in the early 16th century, it has nevertheless remained a Machiavellian trait to encourage a mass surveillance of citizens. In the 21st century, the issue of mass surveillance on citizens has been consistently topical. Whistleblowers like Edward Snowden and Catherine Gunn have highlighted the issue, both former workers of government agencies, the US's NSA and the UK's GCHQ. They have underlined what they consider to be abuses of security and surveillance policy to the detriment of the public. Barack Obama and David Cameron were both pushed to make public statements on the controversies of mass surveillance, whilst the likes of Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi have also been accused of excessive surveillance. This, however, is regarded as typically Machiavellian, as the undertaking of such policy has sought to provide governments with greater control of the public to the disadvantage of public freedom. This rejection of the importance of what Italian journalist Gianni Riotta called ethical integrity aligns with the typical use of the phrase Machiavellian, and according to Riotta, the actions of America's NSA fits this definition perfectly, as what was proposed as the apparent transparency of the internet has been abused in favour of its use for spying and restrictions of secrecy. Machiavelli's true ideology, concerned with the rights of the people and freedoms, would not align with this Machiavellian principle, where the freedoms of the public are actually taken away. So, with the traditional use of the phrase Machiavellian, a Machiavellian modern leader is a dangerously ambitious person who forgoes morality and prefers brutal violence to achieve their aims. They would sacrifice the good of the people to further their self-interests and restrict public freedom to insist that their position is solidified at all costs. It is the popularity of a particular section of Machiavelli's work that has conducted this legacy and resulted in the association of the phrase Machiavellian with leaders such as Lenin and Hitler, with negative reputations for brutality and deceitfulness. However, it must be noticed that there is a difference between Machiavelli and the phrase Machiavellian. Various historians and political philosophers have repositioned Machiavelli's legacy, reaching kind of conclusions on his philosophy and his personal character. This illuminates who Machiavelli really was and what exactly it was which he advocated in his works. Henry J. Abraham, Leo Strauss, and John Pocock have all produced works which have reimagined Machiavelli. All three have provided a valuable context for Machiavelli's creation of The Prince, which makes it seem far more like opportunism than genuine philosophy on Machiavelli's part. As Abraham put it, one of the quite apparent reasons for writing The Prince was Machiavelli's hope of regaining the favour of the Medici. Strauss felt that Machiavelli was giving Lorenzo de' Medici apparent advice on how to unite Italy and rid it of barbarians in The Prince, but truly felt that Lorenzo would not liberate Italy. Pocock treated The Prince as simply a study of what he calls the New Prince, not a work of ideology, but an analytical study to advise the Medicis. Pocock, in the Machiavellian moment, intended to give a historical presentation of Machiavelli, where his true ideology was in his other works, such as the Discourses, which represent Machiavelli as a republican who was concerned with the rights of the people, not in the ability of leaders to abuse their power, often to the people's detriment. Arguing that Machiavelli's work was incredibly influential in the creation of 17th and 18th century English-speaking republicanism, Pocock cut Machiavelli a figure whose political beliefs diverged greatly from the typically Machiavellian politician. Strauss offered a similar view, arguing that Machiavelli was a generous man who loathed oppression and believed in the well-being of the people and an effective government. Abraham, meanwhile, stated that Machiavelli himself was not Machiavellian, and that The Prince, from which the term Machiavellian derives, was possibly the least revealing of Machiavelli's works when deciphering his own personal ideology. This supports the idea that the use of the term Machiavellian in popular culture is not representative of Machiavelli. It is an insufficient legacy which requires disassociation from Machiavelli himself should Machiavelli and his scholarship be better understood. Machiavelli's Discourses on Livy, by comparison, is a far more faithful representation of Machiavelli's true thoughts. Written around 1517, Machiavelli used a historical analysis to study how republics should be run. French Enlightenment philosopher Rousseau considered this a far more illuminating work on Machiavelli's true philosophy than The Prince, claiming that Machiavelli expressed a love of liberty in the midst of his country's oppression, the kind of oppression which The Prince described and advocated. Understanding that Machiavelli was not writing The Prince for the world but only for the Medici, but was writing the Discourses without such pressure, that his views, which he expressed, came closer to his true ideology, we can now look at some of Machiavelli's ideas which were in fact not Machiavellian, and articulate the divergence between Machiavelli and the phrase Machiavellian. This helps to better shape Machiavelli's ideal modern ruler, not the Machiavellian prince, but someone very different. The aforementioned influence that Machiavelli had on 18th century republicanism and constitutionalism is easy to see, as Machiavelli argued that arming citizens in a newly acquired state was integral. To Machiavelli, this ensured that those citizens are loyal to you, that they become your own, that they do not see you as a coward, that they do not have hatred towards you, and that dissidence is removed from the ranks of these new citizens in favour of a relationship of trust. The US Constitution's 1791 Second Amendment stated that Americans had the right to bear arms, with the founding fathers of the USA echoing Machiavelli's advice with this decision. Far from being figures characterised by the features of deceit and scheming which embody the phrase Machiavellian, the founding fathers of the USA are generally celebrated as revolutionary heroes of the Enlightenment era, not cunning politicians who were working for their own goals against the good of their people. This is therefore a very important example of how Machiavelli has been misinterpreted as Machiavellian. Political theorist Wendy Brown saw the Second Amendment as owing much to Machiavellian philosophy, as it was intended to make the citizenry not armed against the state, but armed as the state. Lawrence Kress contended that Americans, with the influence of Machiavelli, saw the militia as an expression of the corporate unity of society and as integral to the maintenance of a balanced, stable and free constitution. These show Machiavelli's preference of a republic philosophy over anything else, and undermine the abilities of the Machiavellian prince in the process, in favour of a society with greater citizen participation. Further exploring this influence which Machiavelli had on American republicanism and constitutionalism, we can see that Machiavelli in the discourses advised that in order to avoid corruption within the state, the length of individuals' terms in power should be restricted. Far from welcoming a tyrannical rule in which corruption is necessary, Machiavelli here praises the wisdom of Roman politician Mamercus to reduce terms of arbiters from 5 years to 18 months. Machiavelli's inspiration in terms of this statement is found in the 22nd Amendment to the US Constitution from 1947, in which it is written that no person shall be elected to the office of the President more than twice, and no person who has held the office of President, or acted as President, for more than 2 years of a term to which some other person was elected President, shall be elected to the office of the President more than once. This was a reaction to Franklin D. Roosevelt's 4 terms as President, and has been the cause of some debate, particularly in the Reagan presidency, when many Reagan supporters attempted to gain support for it to be repealed. However, it has remained in place. Timothy Fuller, in Machiavelli's Legacy, The Prince, After 500 Years, established such a link between Machiavelli's authorization of change as a rejection of corruption and American support for the 22nd Amendment. By limiting those in power to shorter terms in rule, Machiavelli provided a solution for the Machiavellian forms of corruption which are encouraged in The Prince. This represents the ideological shift between Machiavelli and a Machiavellian. Machiavelli offered a conciliatory approach to the hostility of powerful and ambitious potential enemies, arguing that outward hostility could serve as an advantage to such a person. Machiavelli felt that appeasement had its advantages as a way of easing an enemy's threat by giving them smaller successes and avoiding the chances that they will seek a far more encompassing, forceful seizure of power. A believer in the usefulness of conciliatory tactics, the United Kingdom's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain followed such advice in his appeasement, hoping to avoid war by making concessions to the aggressive fascist leaders of Italy and of Germany. This is often criticised as only strengthening such powers. Hitler said in 1939 that our enemies have leaders who are below the average, no personalities, no masters, no men of action. I saw them in Munich. A referral to the Munich Agreement in 1938, which strengthened the position of Hitler and of Germany. Daniel Treisman found that Machiavelli realised that appeasement was particularly necessary when dealing with multiple enemies. just as Chamberlain was with the fascist leaders of Italy and Germany. However, this would not be considered typically Machiavellian. Whilst Hitler was considered Machiavellian, it is actually policy against Hitler which best represents the true beliefs of Machiavelli. He would position his ideals on the side of the nation opposing the dangerous enemy, not on the side of the dangerous enemy who was spearheaded by a Machiavellian prince. Machiavelli also argued that in making great and free nations, it is absolutely integral to consolidate rather than expand. This, rather than an endorsement of the aggressive foreign policy of the US which was considered Machiavellian, offers something different, a policy in which a state's own people are defended and made to prosper, rather than the expansion of a nation through aggression, and encouragement of peace over hostility. This is not so typically Machiavellian. It is well documented that Stalin was a Machiavelli reader, believed to have annotated a copy of The Prince. Most focus on his deceitful nature as Machiavellian, with Service noting that he followed Machiavellian principles in preferring effectiveness over morality. Most, however, then, ignore the political strategy with which Machiavelli influenced Stalin. Stalin and his main rival Leon Trotsky clashed on many issues, but an integral one was whether to consolidate or to expand. Trotsky wanted an expansionist socialism, a permanent revolution in which Russia would never halt in warfare and enact an extremely hostile foreign policy. However, in line with Machiavelli's advice to consolidate, Stalin brought forward the policy of socialism in one country, forgoing expansion for consolidation. There is little doubt that Machiavelli's intention, which was to ensure the creation of a free and happy nation, was not the intention of Stalin. Nevertheless, he followed this advice according to his own principles. Another element of Machiavelli's philosophy which is lost through the sole use of the Machiavellian legacy is his military strategy. Having wrote The Art of War, a treatise on military science written around 1520, this was an important part of Machiavelli's scholarship, and this is not a characteristic of the Machiavellian, a political schemer, more likely to be lurking in the background than risking his life as a military strategist. However, Machiavelli's military advice was extensive and inspired many leaders. One such advice was to be well read in military histories, to learn from the lessons of the past, and to essentially imitate the great military leaders of the ages, just as Alexander the Great had imitated Achilles. American General George S. Patton was a firm believer in the usefulness of this, a keen military historian who based the actions of his armies on the histories which he was well read in. Patton believed in reincarnation, convinced that he had in a previous life been a general in the Roman or Napoleonic armies. Patton was one of the most influential generals of World War II, and chose to use his breadth of knowledge in one of the most important moments of the Second World War, the invasion of Normandy. Patton felt that imitating William the Conqueror's battles on the Normandy and Brittany Peninsula would be a success. According to Geoffrey Sanderson, Patton had read 6 volumes on the Norman conquest prior to the invasion, and made strategic decisions based on this research. Patton is also believed to have read The Prince, so such inspiration is traceable. Patton was also a fatalist, in other words a believer in destiny and inevitability. Whilst Machiavellians are said to be scheming politicians who achieve their goals by their own often brutal means, quite possibly determinists, Machiavelli was actually, to a great extent, a fatalist himself, arguing that whilst there is free will amongst leaders, they are still governed mostly by fortune. And this issue of fortune, virtue and religious belief is one of the most contested areas of Machiavelli's work. The Machiavellian is seen as typically non-religious, immoral and determinist. However, the vast majority of Machiavelli's work makes it clear that fortune and virtue are integral parts of leadership and vital to a person's achievements. Sebastian de Grazia's Machiavellian Hell hoped to rubbish Machiavelli's Machiavellian reputation as an anti-Christian figure, arguing that Christian themes were not absent but actually integral to his works, as Machiavelli's referral to God throughout even The Prince was consistent and imperative to his conclusions. Such quotes as, "Nor was God more their friend than he is yours," are plentiful, and particularly consistent in The Prince's final chapter. Machiavelli's blurring of the roles of fortune and virtue as determining factors on situations is solved by his belief in God's favour, which is the ultimate determining factor in any situation according to Machiavelli. Therefore, a Machiavellian acting immorally would not gain such favour, and would, according to Machiavelli, be unsuccessful in their endeavours. Instead, Machiavelli supports moral actions and religiosity as important to achieving goals. So, it is clear through this study that there is a disparity between what is popularly seen as a Machiavellian leader and what Machiavelli saw as the ideal leader. A Machiavellian leader is immoral, probably non-religious, greedy, an oppressor of their people, and a scheming, deceitful politician who uses brutal force and backstabbing to their advantage at any given opportunity. This Machiavellian leader is driven by Machiavelli's advice in The Prince, despite this being an illegitimate representation of Machiavelli's views. However, Machiavelli's ideal leader is by comparison a largely moral figure who understands the importance of faith, a believer in the constitution and the rights of the people, a well-educated and learned individual who uses his nous to his advantage, and someone who uses force when necessary for the benefit of the Republic. Considering this, the term Machiavellian is certainly an unfair characterization of the ideology and beliefs of Niccolò Machiavelli. The legacy of a Machiavellian completely overshadows the reality of Machiavelli's beliefs, his faith in the Republic, and the rights of the people, which were far more consistent and integral to his writings than the advice in The Prince, which was massively geared by the context which it was written in, for the Medici Prince Lorenzo. For such a relatively small section of Machiavelli's scholarship to be almost wholly responsible for his popular legacy is unjust. Should the phrase Machiavellian be reinterpreted, encompassing all of Machiavelli's writings, then a modern Machiavellian leader would not embody the connotations which were so commonly been aligned towards them, of untruthfulness and of self-interest, but instead act in the interests of the public, so that the state can be healthy through a more honest rule, not through a corrupt one. Therefore, a disassociation between Niccolò Machiavelli and the term Machiavellian is necessary, so that Machiavelli is better understood as a historical figure, not just as a man whose name is put to a shorthand for a set of psychological traits. With this disassociation, it becomes clear that Machiavelli was typical of the Renaissance in his reinterpretation of the reverence of the Republic and the people's rights, by applying it to the early 16th century world that he lived in.